How was she lot, Sir Kristen?
Princess?
Hey guys, Pete here. The only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself. Today I'm going to be talking about the first episode of the new series set in Westeros, almost 200 years before the events of Game of Thrones. I would say that it was mostly a solid start, and I say that as someone who knows where it's going from having read the book. I'll be breaking down what happened in the Heirs of the Dragon and telling you what I thought about it, and I'll be trying to do that in a way that won't spoil what comes next. I will be mentioning interesting details in history along the way, and I'll try my best not to hit you over the head with that if it's not completely necessary to what's going on. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. The series opens with a slight flashback to the Great Council of 101. That's 101 AC, or after Aegon I's conquest of Westeros. In case you have no idea who this dragon-riding family is, they come from a place called Old Valyria to the east. There they were a minor house, but also happened to be the only dragon lords who escaped before a cataclysmic event known as the Doom destroyed Valyria in a day. They weren't just lucky. Beyond their ability to bond with dragons, some of the Targaryens have prophetic dreams. And Rhaenys the Dreamer urged her father to leave after she saw Valyria burn in one of hers. They brought their dragons and their Valyrian steel, and they moved to an island off of the coast of Westeros that they'll call Dragonstone. And it can't be understated just how powerful being the only family with dragons made them. About 100 years after that, Aegon and his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, conquered 6 of the 7 kingdoms that existed in Westeros at that time. Aegon was crowned the first Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, even though Dorne hadn't yielded, and 100 years later, his grandson Jaehaerys called all these lords to Harrenhal for the council. At this time, House Targaryen was about as powerful as it would ever be. As an older Rhaenyra tells us in voiceover, they had 10 adult dragons and no power could stand against them. King Jaehaerys reigned over nearly 60 years of peace and prosperity, and before tragedy took them away, he had what every king wants. He had an heir and a spare in his 2 adult sons. He actually had 13 children and almost none of them outlived him, but that's all just to say that when you have what amounts to magic blood and you keep marrying your relatives to keep it in the family, matters of succession can get complicated. After losing those remaining sons, Jaehaerys opted to let his lords decide who would take over. Over 1,000 of them made their way to Harrenhal to help him choose between Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, the king's eldest descendant, and her younger cousin Prince Viserys, who was his oldest male descendant. The lords chose Viserys, and in doing that, they set the precedent that a woman would never inherit the Iron Throne. Basically, succession would be decided through the male line. For what it's worth, as far as Targaryens go, Jaehaerys was a good king. He wasn't a great father, especially to some of his daughters, but he was a just ruler who kept the realm peaceful and did things like building roads that improved people's lives. Remember the King's Road that stretches from King's Landing all the way to the Wall? That's part of what he left behind. And doing things like consulting with the lords on the line of succession is part of why he was effective. This was a reasonable way to avoid war over who would replace him that works pretty great for everyone except the Targaryen women who get passed over. And that's something that we will come back around to at the end. From there, we jump forward to the 9th year of King Viserys I Targaryen's reign. On the title screen, it tells us that this is 172 years before the death of the Mad King Aerys and the birth of his daughter, Princess Daenerys Targaryen. It's a great choice to open the present timeline with Rhaenyra riding her dragon Syrax. It shows that she bonded with her mount at a young age, and just how common it is for the Targaryens of this era to ride their dragons. No one even looks up when she flies by. I just mentioned Daenerys, and you remember by the time she hatched her dragons, people had all but forgotten them. So we know that we're in a different time, and for good measure, we get a look at the intact dragon pit that looks a lot different than when we'll see it again in the 7th season of Game of Thrones. All of this looks fantastic, and it's a great way to start things off on the right foot, because this episode has a lot of table setting to do. In a bit of a whirlwind, you get a look at King's Landing and the Red Keep. You meet her mother, Queen Aemma, and get a reminder that producing children is considered their duty as their way to serve the realm. You also meet her father's small council, and I think they did a pretty good job of planting the seeds of who all these characters are in a short amount of time. One thing that stood out to me that's promising is that everything feels intentional. As I mentioned, they have a lot to get through, a lot of people to introduce, and it felt mostly restrained in not over-explaining things. There are some natural questions that arise from what you watch here. Why is Corlys Velaryon talking about this thing called the Triarchy? This Lyman Beesbury doesn't hold back from speaking his mind to the king, as opposed to Lionel Strong. What's up with that guy? Is he a little slow, or is he just a man of few words? Of course, all the people closest to the king will have important parts to play as things take off, especially his hand, Otto Hightower, the sea snake, Corlys Velaryon, who they didn't focus too much attention on here, and the council member who's missing, his younger brother Daemon. In his absence, you get a real sense that Otto isn't a fan, and get an idea of why that is when Rhaenyra meets him in the throne room. I guess this feels like old news now, but if you haven't been following the trailers closely, you'll notice the throne looks a lot more menacing than it did by the time Robert Baratheon sat on it after his successful rebellion against the Mad King Aerys. This is closer to how it was described in the books, and you'll also notice that the throne room is missing the Star of the Seven adorning the windows. Rhaenyra and Uncle Daemon have a conversation in High Valyrian to show that they are close. Maybe too close considering their family is known to be super into incest. Their use of this language illustrates that they share something, and he also gives her a Valyrian steel necklace, which of course is related to their heritage. Having him sit on the throne is a way of saying, hey, look, this guy doesn't necessarily follow the rules, and you get a vague idea about his ambition when he says it would be his chair, he would be the heir if her mother doesn't manage to give her father a son. Most of what's happening here and what comes after is added by the show to develop the characters. I don't think it's necessary to point out all the differences as we go, but I will say I think most of them make sense to make things work better in a TV show. Probably the one that jumps out the most is that in the next scene, you find out that Rhaenyra and Otto's daughter Alicent Hightower are close friends. This is never developed in the books, and it just serves as a way to get to know them better while adding a dimension to what happens later. You see that Rhaenyra is more spirited, and that Alicent might be the more clever of the two. I mean, she's lugging around giant books in 2/3 of her scenes. That has to mean something, right? What stands out from these two scenes is the fact that Rhaenyra, who is very young at this point in the book, wouldn't necessarily have ambition as a princess. It's just the life that she was born into, and as she tells her friend, what she's really interested in is riding her dragon and eating cake. It's the people around her that are concerned about the shifting dynamics of power, as her parents are trying to deliver a male heir to shut down any problems that might come up related to the succession. At the same time in this episode, you get the idea that Uncle Daemon might be more interested in power. Through this brutal sequence of his city watch gelding rapists and lopping off the hands of pickpockets, you get the idea of why the small council isn't enthusiastically united in wanting to see him become the next king. This role is also the last in a line of different positions Viserys has installed him in, with Otto Hightower undermining his fitness for each one along the way. The violence on display doesn't just call into question whether or not he would be a good ruler. After all, as a second son, that's not his birthright, but it's also about a larger point that's just under the surface. In a great small character moment a bit later, we see Rhaenys react when real violence breaks out at the tourney. With a sigh, she says, "and the day grows ugly," and goes on to lay out the unintended side effect of 70 years of peace. It's said that the seeds of war are often planted in times just like this, because the warrior class, and a guy like Prince Daemon, who spend every waking moment training constantly for battle, have never known real war. It's interesting to watch where that comes out, and how that lack of war, not knowing the real horrors involved, informs decisions by several members of her family as the story continues. And I just want to say that I love how they had her play this with a sort of disconnected disdain for what was going on as she sits above it with her family and sips from her cup of wine. This is a story about succession and people's relative positions in wanting to hold on to power, but it's also a tale about people who never understood how bad war could be or thought that it wouldn't affect them directly. So it's great how they play all these mid-episode scenes off of each other. The small council's response to Daemon's methods as head of the City Watch, his blowing off steam with his favorite courtesan Mysaria that ends in impotence, his notable skill in the violence as entertainment of the tourney, and then they juxtapose all of that with the horror that unfolds for Aemma during childbirth. This was a complete shock to me since this is a scene that's taken from a different character in another part of the book. I knew that she'd die and her son would only outlive her for a short period of time, but wasn't expecting to see Viserys have to make the decision to let Grand Maester Mellos try to save the child through an emergency C-section. It was difficult to watch and it was certainly a choice to include it. They could have easily cut away after their conversation and you would have understood what happened, but I think it was a choice that makes sense. In a way, all the violence that's happening is sanctioned. We watch as the men smash each other's heads in for sport and glory, while Aemma is cut to pieces without any say in what happens to her, when for no fault of her own she can't fulfill her purpose of providing an heir. It's a great nod to the inevitability of things in this world for these characters, and how things are quite different for men and women. The show did a good job of setting things up, so that we know Aemma sees this as her role. An idea that she'd pass on to her own daughter, that Viserys respected her decision for this to be her last pregnancy, at least in that moment, and that still neither one of them was prepared for what they encountered on the battlefield that was her bed. Mother and infant son are cremated by Rhaenyra's dragon Syrax in a small family ceremony. Otto and the rest of the small council immediately bring up the succession, which prompts a meltdown from Viserys, who's in mourning, but as ill-timed as it might have been, it puts some things into motion. Otto has a heart-to-heart with his daughter Alicent, where he encourages her to go and try to comfort the king. Daemon is comforting himself and his brothers in the gold cloaks at a brothel and what could best be described as an orgy. I wouldn't say he was celebrating though. It's actually a pretty great small performance where you can't tell if he feels bad about his brother or if he might hate himself for the life that he's chosen to live. It certainly hints that there might be more to the character, but he makes a remark about the deceased being the heir for a day that Otto is quick to run and tell the king about, and that earns him a ticket out of King's Landing. He leaves with Mysaria on the back of his dragon Caraxes, and his brother makes a decision. He calls for his daughter, and they talk in front of the skull of Balerion the Black Dread, the dragon that Aegon the Conqueror rode, and the one that Viserys rode himself until it died of old age. He tells her that he's making her his heir, and then the show adds a bit of information that George R.R. Martin has hinted at, but notably didn't mention in any of his books, including the huge fake history about House Targaryen that this show is based on. He lets her in on a family secret that is only passed from king to heir. When he came to Westeros, Aegon had a dream. He foresaw the end of the world of men. It is to begin with a terrible winter, gusting out of the distant north. Aegon saw absolute darkness riding on those winds, and whatever dwells within will destroy the house of the living. When this great winter comes, all of Westeros must stand against it. A Targaryen must be seated on the throne to unite the realm. Aegon called his dream the Song of Ice and Fire, and this secret has been passed from king to heir since his time, and now you must promise to carry it and protect it. I've known about this for a while and I'm still not sure how I feel about it. On the one hand, it connects the two series, and if it's coming from the author himself, then I suppose on some level it's not up for debate. On the other, it sort of changes my thoughts on who the Targaryens are and why they conquered Westeros in the first place. It's not to say that both of those things can't exist inside this universe. It was just sort of a surprise, and so I suppose we'll have to wait and see what they do with it. What I liked more here was his warning about the idea of them controlling the dragons being an illusion. He says that they're a power that men should have never trifled with, and one that brought Valyria to its doom. Even though his earlier dream about his son being born with an iron crown didn't pan out the way he thought it would, maybe Viserys is a little little wiser than we give him credit for. Either way, the king calls his lords to the throne room and declares Rhaenyra his heir. You see her smile at her father, turn to look at the crowd, and then it cuts to black while it looks as though the weight of the realm is resting on her shoulders. And in the black, you hear the sound of dragons. I thought this was a really promising introduction to a story that, if I'm being honest, wasn't one of my favorites in the greater Ice and Fire universe. I thought it was great as a historical footnote about something tragic that has to happen, but wasn't sure how it would translate into a multi-season series that essentially becomes a Horrors of War story. Going in, I was thinking the show needed to do two things: establish itself as distinct, be something different than the show that came before it, while leaning into some of the things that drew us to that in the first place. Also, it needed to find a way to make us care about these characters. I think the premiere does both of those things while having to deal with being more about setup at the same time. I think most of the issues that I had with it could be chalked up to that. It's a premiere, it has to introduce the world, there's no getting around that. It's interesting though, because what really works here is all part of a calm before the storm. Seeing Rhaenyra in her phase where she's known as the Realm's Delight is a great introduction. Millie Alcock does a fantastic job of making her seem distinct from her family enough to make her shine, even if it is just part of the innocence of her youth. I really appreciated the through line with her saying that the only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself in the beginning of the episode, and then at the end saying that everyone says Targaryens are closer to gods than to men, but they say that because of their dragons. Without them, they're just like everyone else. Those two lines do a lot of work to set things up, and I like how they use them as bookends. As far as the leaning into things we already like part, the score, the set design, the costumes, all of that is up to the standard we expect. In some ways, it even seems better. The world looks authentic and lived in, and there are details everywhere to keep the hardcore fans satisfied. There are two other areas that I often hear other people debate, but I don't usually pay that much attention to: CGI and wigs. The former seems pretty good to me. Normally, as long as the CGI doesn't take me out of the story, I'm okay with it. But the dragons seem to clear that mark by a wide margin. The wigs, on the other hand, actually do kind of get on my nerves here, but it's more about how the silver reads as gray and makes all the characters look older than they should be. Like, it's supposed to be silver and they're supposed to look really otherworldly and cool, but it just didn't seem to work for me. And this is compounded by some of them being much older than what they're actually playing. For example, Rhaenys and Viserys are supposed to be in their mid to early 20s at the Council of 101. And when I checked by asking my wife how old she thought they were supposed to be, she guessed much closer to the actors' ages in real life. It's a small thing, and we are going to be moving forward in time anyway, but it really kind of got on my nerves when I went back to take my notes. They pulled off the tourney and the jousting, especially that shot of Daemon sliding over the rail in some pretty badass armor, and I like that they aren't shying away from keeping it as a show for grown-ups by including the nudity and sex, which are a big part of how these folks spend their downtime in the books. They managed to make most of the characters seem interesting, even though they didn't spend much time with any of them. For example, Otto seems like a scheming douche, especially after he sent his young daughter to the king's chambers to comfort him while wearing one of her mother's dresses. But he's a necessary douche, and you get that. Beyond being absolutely caught up in his distaste for Daemon, he's effective at his job. After all, while Viserys is likable enough, it seems apparent that ruling the realm isn't his strong suit. And don't take my word for it, or Paddy Considine's great depiction of that, the fact that he keeps getting cut by the Iron Throne is really the only evidence you need. I guess the next trick they have to pull off is to flesh out the main characters and make us want to watch them if we can't root for them. Sometimes there's a welcome honesty present in watching bad people do bad things, as it speaks to the irredeemability of the systems that perpetuate the underlying conditions. And sometimes it's just viscerally satisfying to watch fictional depictions of people tearing each other apart. The show will no doubt deliver those things in equal amounts. What I hope is that I'll be tuning in because I care what happens, rather than just not being able to look away. I think the dragons will keep some people coming back, but the question of why they're not around during a Game of Thrones is going to start to hang over things. I mean, a part of even the most casual fan must know that it's not like they formed a union and decided to live out their lives in the hills after retirement. So I'll be interested to see how people experience that. And I think that's a good place to leave things. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the premiere and what you're hoping to see in the upcoming episodes. I'm not sure if I'm going to do episode recaps throughout the whole season. This is going to be a saturated space, so if no one watches them, I'm not sure I'll be putting this much time in each week, but I'll definitely be watching the show and will probably make different videos instead. So please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.